Hi everyone, nice to see you. My name is Kaisa Raatikainen and I currently work at the Finnish Environment Institute as a senior research scientist, but most of the work that I will be talking today is the research that I did in University of Jyväskylä, which was my previous employer. And here today I will draw together some insights from this transdisciplinary art and science project that we had that studied human-nature relations in the Finnish context. And let's begin with examining what human-nature relations are. So they are essentially connections between people and nature that range from material ones, such as eating, to philosophical ones, such as how do you perceive nature and how do you orient yourself within the world that you live in. These different types of human-nature connections can be categorized into an order of so-called deepness that here ranges from material to experiential to cognitive to emotional and to philosophical categories, where the philosophical nature relations or nature connectedness is seen as the most deepest one or the innermost to us as perceivers. And these deep connections to nature are really difficult to reach because they are often difficult to verbalize, whereas the material connections, like what you eat, is very easy to measure and follow on a daily basis even. So when we are talking about sustainability, which is a huge challenge for our societies today, we have evidence that these deeper nature connections hold the most potential for launching the sustainability transitions and transformations in the society that we really need in these days. So it is these experiential, cognitive, emotional and philosophical nature connections that play a key role in supporting the systemic transformation towards sustainability. And these different categories are actually interlinked, so we can see that certain material choices that we make in our everyday lives are actually grounded and rooted in these deeper types of connections, the emotional connections and the philosophical stances that we have towards nature. And it is typical for many studies that discuss their findings within a sustainability setting to have this kind of typical narrative. So let's think about energy production and climate change. So it's very usual for studies to enter discussion with this kind of narrative. Energy production and consumption affects climate, causing climate change, which results in changed weather conditions, and then people perceive, experience these changes in their everyday lives. But if you give them more knowledge and educate them on the environmental impacts of their ways of life, of the energy consumption of their lives, this helps people to understand these systemic causalities that are driving climate change. And this then motivates people to make more sustainable choices that respect nature. Well, this sounds very nice, but it doesn't work in practice because this is a bit of a naive way of thinking about how we people act, behave, and how our societies function. So this is why the sustainability scientists are currently having a lot of interest in studying these deeper inner human-nature relations, which are difficult to study, but they can be reached via arts-based methods. And by arts-based methods, I will be talking about various creative means that can be utilized in research inquiry, including writing, music, dance, performance, visual art, film, and other mediums. And we tested this out in a Sacred Place project that was a project funded by Kone Foundation that ran for 3 years. And it was a transdisciplinary inquiry into human-nature relations and the multidimensionality behind the relations. And this project was based on a true dialogue between art and science. Both artistic practices and research practices were of equal importance in this project. And we had a certain place in central Finland, which was the Hitonhauta conservation area that sort of rooted us into nature. And this place, Hitonhauta, served as a stage for site-specific performance. And this was a really good and successful project, and the success is thanks to the dedication of 4 team members. We all had different backgrounds, and we were all putting a lot of our hearts and souls into this work. So myself, Anna-Mari Laulumaa, who was the artistic director in the project, and then Riikka Niemelä, who worked as a postdoctoral researcher, and Anna-Kaisa Tupala, who was doing her doctoral thesis at the time. All right. So then some theory. We adopted a relational perspective on what human-nature relations are, because we wanted to understand the dimensions behind the different kinds of the relational types. There is literature available, and we utilized it, but made this kind of own theoretical framework that we utilized in our transdisciplinary work, because we were talking a lot in plain language, and therefore terms like ontology was not very useful for us, but we would be talking about how humans and nature were related to each other. So these 6 basic dimensions that we utilized in our analysis were this human-nature relation, how emotion and experience plays role in how people understand their relation to nature. Then we had an intention, action, and behavior, this kind of hands-on dimension as well. Engagement refers how deeply people related themselves to nature. Practice is more of a societal dimension, how we as a community sort of practice our lives within the natural setting that our societies are rooted in. And then finally we had the cognitive dimension of conception and thought. And actually when we think about the types of nature connections that I presented earlier, the material, experiential, cognitive, emotional, and philosophical kinds of human nature collection. So these quite easily found their places within this kind of theoretical framework. All right. Then I will shortly show how we combined approaches from environmental social sciences and arts-based research into a mixed methods design. So to begin, we had 3 research questions. And firstly, we conducted a public online survey that was used to collect both qualitative and quantitative data linked to these dimensions of human-nature relations, the theoretical dimensions that I explained. These are denoted here with different colors. And then these survey data were analyzed to reveal shared nature conceptualizations and nature-related discourses in the Finnish context. We used the factor analysis to detect patterns among nature-related statements and interpreted these patterns as discourses, which then matched the general human-nature relations that exist within the Finnish society. The similarities and the differences of these relations were then investigated to better understand the underlying dimensionality, again, the different colors. And then parallel to this survey setup, we had the site-specific performance, which was the artistic part of our project. It was arranged together with qualitative research on audience members' experiences on nature. And we collected interview data which proved to be extremely rich, so we needed to analyze it in 2 phases. So we had to focus on specific parts of that data. We were really interested in finding out the embodied and emotional aspects of nature experiences of the audience. And then finally, the results from the different analytical pathways were compared to each other. And in this presentation, I will talk about just tiny bit of the results. But before we go into that, let's have a look at the performance. So Anna-Mari Laulumaa, who is professional in theater, conceptualized and directed the site-specific performance that took place at the Hitonhauta Conservation Area. And the purpose of the performance was to reflect on different kinds of Finnish human-nature relations in an authentic setting. And this performance has been documented in video format, but I will show now you some photographs because we also had a photographer on site. So, as Hitonhauta is located in middle of the woods, the audience was carried to the site with a tractor trailer. The audience took part in the performance as small groups of around 10 people at the time, and as the COVID-19 pandemic was very much present, we had to take respective cautions, of course. And the performance was structured so that the audience group would walk through the Hitonhauta nature trail. It is 2 kilometers long, but it took for them 2 hours approximately to go through it, because there were things happening alongside the trail. The terrain was quite rough, as you can see here, and this is not even the worst spot. But luckily, each group had a guide who knew the route and who would lead their walk through the region. And in between the transitional walks, the audience would sit down and watch short scenes by participating performance that portrayed different aspects of the human-nature relations. And as a whole, this walk was done in silence. The audience was allowed to talk only after the last scene, and after the whole performance, they could take part in the research interview. And the duration of the walk was, as I said, approximately 2 hours, but the whole event took maybe something like 3.5 hours, so it was really like a half-day effort for people. All right, then the 8 scenes, most of which were wordless, by the way, they used various forms of expression. And the first one represented the importance of forests for Finns. Another topic was death and respect of the deceased. Geological timescales were also represented. The Lutheran settler spirit, climate change, the healing power of nature, and finally, the ending scene was a monologue based on writings of Pentti Linkola that put into words the imbalance of our current contemporary way of life and the nature and biodiversity. All right, what were the research findings then? So both the survey respondents and the interviewed audience members portrayed nature very positively. It was evident that nature meant a lot to them, which was reflected in their rich descriptions of their personal relationships with nature. The importance of embodied experiences was emphasized in the interview data, and the participants, the audience members, expressed being connected not only with the nature at the Hitonhauta location, but to themselves as they were walking through the path, and also to the other members of that audience group that they were part of. And then if we think back to the 5 types of nature connections, material, experiential, cognitive, emotional, and philosophical, we found that they are strongly interlinked and complemented with a social layer of people being connected to each other within nature. And then we analyzed the survey data and detected 6 different ways in which people relate to nature. And these human-nature relations typical to Finns are well-being, enjoyment, outdoor activity, pro-environmentalism, eco-anxiety, and conservation of nature or natural habitats. Of these 6 nature relations, well-being derived from nature was by far the strongest. So that can be seen as the dominant discourse of nature in our contemporary society. These relational types reflect the society and public discourses on nature, for example, through the well-being discourse, but also through the pro-environmentalist speaking and thinking, and also the importance of outdoor activities in people's lives, such as physical exercising on the one hand, but also the mental restorative effects and emphasizing of them on the other hand. And now it is important to note, of course, that these human-nature relations are not universal, but these are very specific to the Finnish setting and, of course, to the participants that we had in our project. So, of course, because of the Hitonhauta trail was so difficult to go through, we only had people who could walk through it, who took part in the performance. And because our survey was collected on a voluntary basis online, it is very much of the case that people who are interested in nature would then respond to that survey. But what are then the transferable findings from our work? And now we go back to the theoretical framework. These more universal results come from the analysis of the relational dimensions underlying the observed human-nature relations. So we were able to structure these different relations along the theoretical dimensions identified from the previous research. And if we start with two of them, if we start with human-nature positionality, being more focused either on nature or on people, and compare that with passive to active engagement of people with nature, we see that 3 of the human-nature relations were inclined towards ecocentrism. These were pro-environmentalism, natural habitats, and eco-anxiety. And then, on the other hand, there were 3 types of relations that had more of an anthropocentric emphasis. These were outdoor activity, well-being, and enjoying of nature. Then we made another comparison between the cognitively defined dimension of conception and thought about nature and 2 different orientations in how human-nature relations were framed, either through emotion and experience or through intention, action, and behavior. We found out that the relations of enjoyment, well-being, and eco-anxiety had a very strong emotional component in them, whereas relations emphasizing pro-environmentalism and outdoor activity were more action-oriented. And then the 6th nature relation that emphasized the conservation value of natural habitats was very hard to locate along these 2 dimensions. Then our overall finding is then that diversity of human-nature relations exists in Finland. There is no single one way in which humans relate to nature. And this diversity coexists and co-evolves with the common mindset of nature appreciation. It appears that the values shared by Finnish citizens towards nature have significant potential in leveraging sustainable living, but the realization of this potential is very strongly counteracted by systemic structures and societal goals. For example, the prevalent consumerism in our society and also the dependence on economic growth on the broader level as well. And we also noted that human-nature relations are highly dynamic. For example, this recent rise of health-oriented well-being discourse evidently supports the well-being-oriented relation with nature, with health being the unifying value behind. And these kind of dynamic processes raise questions on whether these underlying values, such as health, are driving the observed changes in human-nature relations or not. These kind of causalities are tedious to study. In any case, it appears that cultural change can be rapid despite resistant societal structures. And then, as for the need for future research, we found that the importance of emotions in framing human-nature relations and people's behaviors towards nature that were highlighted in the well-being, enjoyment, and eco-anxiety relations calls for particular attention. And then, finally, I would like to reflect a bit on what we learned from combining the arts-based practices into this project and into this research. And for this purpose, I have now crafted an equation of 4 variables, which are pausing, pushing on, opening up, and appreciating. And the first P is for pausing. It illustrates how engaging in arts-based practice allowed the participants for blending into the moment. This phenomenon has different labels in different contexts. It can be called mindfulness, flow, or as we say it in flamenco, art people, we speak about duende. And then the second P, pushing on, has two meanings, and therefore I frame it here as exponential, so that is double the effort. Firstly, pushing on emphasizes that combining art with science was not an easy task at all, but required everyone involved to venture out of their comfort zones. Secondly, being in nature at the mercy of the weather and amid the rugged terrain forced the performance and the audience into a physical connection with the environment. They really had to push on while adapting to the surrounding nature. O then stands for opening up. It means sensing of nature, feeling connected to nature, and a deep reflection of the experience. Some participants remarked how they could observe nature in a focused way, noting sounds of the leaves rustling, feeling the warm softness of the moss they were sitting on, or the cold hardness of the rocks that were leaning on. And then other audience members described feelings of awe and fracture, of awakening to realize how their everyday practices impact nature in a large scale. And then the last but not the least part of the equation is A, for appreciating. It highlights how the participants embraced the many values of nature. Being part of the performance made it easier for them to describe and verbalize what nature meant for them and to understand their own personal relationship with nature. And by that, I thank you and references for those interested.